Welcome to Art History from a Queer Perspective, Vignettes During the Virus, number 2. Special thanks to Sarah E. Avery for the donation that made this video presentation possible. Thanks, Sarah. I'm Liz Bradbury. I'm the director of the Training Institute at the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center. At the Community Center, the Training Institute offers LGBT cultural competency trainings and other trainings on LGBT issues. But I also teach art history from a queer perspective in the center a couple of times a year, 4 classes a couple of times a year, but we can't do it this year because we have to do social distancing. So I'm presenting in real time art history from a queer perspective in vignettes during the virus, and this is number 2. So this is a short vignette. It'll be about the Harlem Renaissance. There's Harlem there in New York City, and what was happening in Harlem during the time, and specifically I'll be speaking about jazz lesbian singer Gladys Bentley, and there she is, Gladys Bentley. This is Lesbian Visibility Week, so I'm talking about lesbians this week for several of the presentations. So let's get to it. So what brought people to Harlem, and why did the Harlem Renaissance happen? So during the Civil War, after the Civil War, when Black people were emancipated and slavery was ended, people hoped that the Reconstruction would allow for positive circumstances for Black people. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. So even after 35 years, in 1900, more than 90% of the U.S. Black population lived in the rural South, and there really were very few opportunities there for Black people. So what we experienced was the Great Migration, and Black folks who lived in the South moved to cities in the North. They moved to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Columbus and Buffalo and Boston, and particularly New York City in the Harlem area. So by the end of the Great Migration, in about 1919, about 80%, less than 20 years, about 80% of the Black population lived in cities. And what they found in cities was more opportunity for jobs and upward mobility. What you're seeing in this photograph could not have happened in the rural South, but it was happening for some people in northern cities and for some Black people. There was certainly still segregation, discrimination, and oppression for Black people in cities in the North, but the opportunities were really different. One of the things that happened was people were able to organize. And large groups of Black people were able to organize and try to speak up and begin to speak up for equality and demand recognition and respect. This sign here says, "The new Negro has no fear." And when they talk about the new Negro or the new woman, what they're talking about is people who were no longer satisfied or going to put up with being treated as second-class citizens, and they were beginning to demand equality. So they were organizing, and this particular picture took place in Harlem. So now, when you talk about the Harlem Renaissance, that included white people visiting Harlem, and so why was it that white people wanted to visit Harlem? So let's look at a couple of reasons that affected this. One of them was Constitutional Amendment 18, which went into effect in January of 1920. And if you were at the community center while I was teaching this class, I'd ask this question, and if you knew the answer that it was prohibition, you would win a prize, because that's when prohibition started. Prohibition banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of liquor in the United States completely. It was called the Volstead Act, and it was passed by every legal voter in the U.S. had an opportunity to vote for it or against it, and it was passed in 1919. So no legal alcohol was available in the United States from 1919 to 1933 when it was repealed. And it was an incredibly stupid idea. The federal government had no equipment to really enforce the Volstead Act. And yet, People were required by the police to throw out beer, to get rid of the kegs of beer that they had and the other kegs of liquor and whiskey and any other kind, wine. They had to end all of production. They had to throw it out the window. And that was the end for more than 20 years, 24 years it was altogether, of legal liquor in the United States. What happened, among other things, was that it caused the rise of organized crime because a huge amount of the American population really wanted the access to beer and wine and other kinds of liquor. They thought it was a stupid law, and so they were willing to buy illegal liquor from speakeasies and from people who were breaking the law. And when you break the law like that, you create liquor that people really want to buy, you make a lot of money, and you don't pay any taxes because you can't declare it in your taxes. Some people believed and voted for prohibition because they believed it would end domestic violence. And in reality, people believed that alcohol was what caused men to beat up women. It wasn't just, men. So they didn't decide to crack down on men beating up women. They decided to get rid of the alcohol and blame that. And of course, that didn't work either. So other things happened during that time that caused various different attitudes to change in the United States. And one of the things happened on November 11th, 1918. So what happened then? That was when the American soldiers joined the war in World War I. They became part of the war effort in World War I to fight against Germany. The World War I had been going on since 1914, and it was being fought in Europe. And young men and the American people, the American government decided to enter the war because Germany had attacked various aspects of the United States. So about 4 million American soldiers fought in World War I. It was really only a little bit more than a year that they were there fighting, maybe 2 years that they were there fighting. And that was 4 million out of a total of 65 million total soldiers in the war. Most of them were Europeans. Of the number, that included Tricia's dad, my wonderful partner Patricia Sullivan's father. He joined the war effort in 1914. He was 16 years old, and he relinquished his American citizenship, became a citizen of Canada, and went to Europe to fight for King George. So under King George, and he was a kid really, but he believed it was the right thing to do. This was a terrible, 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 horrible war. It was different than other wars that had been fought up until that point. For one aspect, the German government was really ready for this war, and the rest of the Allies were not. They had bombs and bombers, bombing airplanes. They had machine guns. They had airplanes equipped with machine guns, strafing guns. They had tanks. They had little tanks. They had poison gas. It was devastating. Poison gas was something that particularly killed soldiers in the early part of the war. They would be hiding in the trenches, and the gas, which was heavier than air, would seep over, would roll over the fields and go down into the trenches, and mustard gas would destroy the soldiers' lungs. And that's actually what happened to Tricia's dad. He was gassed during the first part of World War I, and actually many, many soldiers that were wounded in the first part of World War I were the only ones that really made it out, because truthfully, if they weren't put into hospitals and no longer able to fight, they ended up going back to the battlefield, and many, many, many of them died. Tricia's father was affected by being gassed for the rest of his life, although he lived to be a very old man. There were 20 million deaths as a result of World War I, and it was a horrific war. About half of them were from famine and disease. And the most prevalent disease was, of course, the flu epidemic of 1918, which we're hearing so much about now as it's compared to COVID-19. At that time, from that flu epidemic, 1 in 3 people in the entire world had that flu. They didn't understand about social distancing. They didn't do it. And as a result, 50 million to 100 million people actually died of the flu. That flu struck young people the age of between 20 and 40. It particularly struck them, and it was so strong that people could get it in the morning and be dead by the end of the day. It was much more serious in many ways than COVID-19. It was much more contagious, and it was much more devastating. And it killed 100 million people. It changed everything. And so one of the things that happened was that people who were wounded during soldiers who were wounded during on the battlefield would be taken to field hospitals where there would be big open spaces where there would be cot after cot after cot of wounded guys that were being treated by young nurses who were also in that 20 to 40 demographic. And one of them could get the flu, and it would cause all of them to get the flu and many of them to die, including the nurses and the doctors. So it was a devastating circumstance, very grim. In fact, during that flu epidemic, my grandmother died. She was 27 years old, and she had two young children, including my father, who was 4, and she was taken by the flu as well. She lived in South Dakota. Another thing that happened during World War I was the prevalence of black soldiers. Black soldiers actually got some level of respect. When they were fighting during World War I, they were black units. There was certainly still segregation in the armed forces, the American armed forces. But in France, there was a tendency to respect black people more than in the United States or Great Britain. And black soldiers did have, were treated fairly, or more fairly. There were also women fighting or being part of the war effort as well. Before World War I, women who were nurses were not professional. They didn't get paid. They weren't in the armed services. And often they were either, during the Civil War, they were prostitutes, or they were relatives of the persons that had been wounded that they were tending. But in World War I, there was a great deal of respect for the young women who were patriotically volunteering for war services, being nurses, being administrators, being code breakers. They were doing important jobs during World War I as well. And you could see by the look on these women's faces that this is not a fluffy thing. They are there for serious business, and they did it. It was very hard. So at the end of 1919, when the armistice was signed, the young soldiers came back. And they came back to the United States, and they were happy and jubilant, but they'd gone through just hell. And they wanted to get a glass of beer, but they couldn't, because the Volstead Act was in place, and they couldn't get wine, they couldn't get beer, they couldn't do any of those things. And they were devastated. They were angry because young people really wanted to be able to go out with their friends and have a drink or celebrate or something, but they couldn't do it. Why hadn't these teenage soldiers and these young women voted against the 18th Amendment? It was up to every voter in the United States. Why didn't they just vote against it? Well, here's why. They couldn't vote because in those days you had to be 21 to vote. Remember, Trish's father was 16 when he was in the military. When he got out of the military, he was 18, but he couldn't vote until he was 21 years old. And women couldn't vote at all until 1920, when suffrage was passed in the United States and women were allowed to vote. So these people didn't even have the opportunity to make the decision about whether or not they would be able to get a drink. So Gertrude Stein coined the phrase the lost generation. And the lost generation was the group, the demographic of people who became adults during or shortly after World War I. And this group of people who fought in the war, who served in the war, who had people who died in the war, they saw the horror, even of the flu epidemic. They were disillusioned. They were disillusioned by life. They were disillusioned by the horror of war. And so they rebelled against the traditions of their parents. And here's one example. So in 1914, this is the way women dressed. Women who had long skirts. Even the nurses at the beginning of the war had to have long skirts like that actually soaked up the blood and mud on the floor of the field hospitals. Women dressed that way in 1914, and they were expected to dress. That was the fashion. And that fashion had been that way for many years, for many generations, with long dresses. But just 6 years later, actually 5 years later, the new fashion was for women to dress like this. This was a flapper. This was a modern dress. And everybody dressed this way to party. It wasn't just young women, older women dressed with short skirts and light, flimsy clothes, not those big layers of clothes. Everything was different with regard to how they dressed. That's one aspect of the rebellion against the mores of the past. This, again, this was 1915. This was 1920, just 5 years later. This was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, when in 1920, just 5 years before. So imagine this is 2020. Imagine how different the fashions were 5 years ago, where everybody wore completely different clothes than they do now. Of course, that's not true. I mean, I'm wearing the same pants that I had then. So there wasn't that kind of difference. But this difference came from a rebellion with regard to the horror of war. And so people in New York City, they wanted to party. They wanted to forget the war. They wanted to forget the flu epidemic. They wanted to forget everything. They wanted to go out and have a drink. But here, they wanted to dance. But there was no place to buy a drink legally because of the Volstead Act. So what happened was they flocked to Harlem to engage in vices that they would not attempt in their own communities. Harlem had clubs where people could get a drink. And here's a bunch of white people partying on New Year's Eve in Harlem at the Cotton Club. Harlem was exotic and arty and seemed wildly exciting, and it was. And under the administration of Mayor Jimmy Walker, and here's Jimmy Walker over here, a handsome young man, Jimmy Walker was very progressive. He hated prohibition, and he caused the police to look away from the speakeasies. Speakeasies were where you could get a drink that was illegal. And he told the police to not enforce a lot of the laws with regard to alcohol, particularly in the Harlem area. So the Cotton Club was a wild, exciting place. And in fact, here's a map of all of Harlem where loads and loads, not just the Cotton Club, but all sorts of different clubs where you could dance and eat and listen to jazz. And it was exciting and interesting. And it wasn't just about music. It was about art and writing and sculpture and playwrights and poetry. All of those people in the Harlem Renaissance, particularly queer people, were also involved in this as well. In fact, some scholars today say that the Harlem Renaissance was about queerness as much as it was about Black people. And lots and lots of crossover there as well. But the top clubs were segregated, and they were set up to make racist white people feel more comfortable. So, we have the Lenox Lounge, we have the Cotton Club. Both of those were segregated places. Black people could entertain. They could be waiters and chefs and busboys, but they couldn't sit down at the table and mix with the white crowds. But there were a few clubs on Jungle Alley, which was part of Harlem, that allowed mixed clientele. And that was attractive to people as well, so that Black people could eat and get a drink and watch the show and sit at tables with white people or sit at tables around white people. And that was a legitimate thing to do. And this was a new thing that could happen in the United States and in New York at that time. Also, at the Savoy Club, they hosted an annual drag ball, and there were a lot of gay bars in Harlem at that time as well that people knew were gay bars and were exciting speakeasies where people could go that were really queer. So when you look at this picture of the Cotton Club, don't just look at this as a group of people having fun. Look at it as a group of white people who in the front of them is Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway's the guy that's holding the baton there, and he's leading his orchestra. His orchestra was Black, and he was Black, but there aren't any Black people in the crowd. They are entertaining the white people, but there is no opportunity for Black people to be part of that group. So what was happening in Harlem at that time was that there were a lot of wonderful jazz singers, a lot of wonderful jazz women singers, and a lot of them were queer. So let's look at some of them. Ethel Waters, here she is. Ethel Waters became a very famous movie star, but she was bisexual. She sang about being bisexual. She had relationships with women that were pretty obvious. Bessie Smith, here she is, wonderful blues singer. She was bi as well. Alberta Hunter, she was a lesbian. She was in a 52-year relationship with her partner for most of her life, till the end of her life. Mabel Hampton was another lesbian a jazz singer that was in Harlem. There was Lucille Bogan. She was bi. And there was the wonderful Ma Rainey. Here she is. She was bisexual, but she would stand on the stage like these other women. And Ma Rainey, one of her songs was called "Prove It on Me," had this line: "Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men." And she sang that from the stage, and this was not a secret. So Gladys Bentley, who I'm really going to talk about today, she's the vignette, and Gladys Bentley was a blues singer, a pianist, a drag king, an entertainer. She was a lesbian, and she was a writer. And here she is. She grew up in Philadelphia. She arrived in Harlem in 1923 at just 16-year-old, and she began her career right then. In the 20s and 30s, she always performed in traditionally men's clothing. And here she is with her top hat. She was not wearing gender-neutral clothes. These were men's clothes. In 1930, Bentley was, by the time she got to 1930, just 7 years later, she was an absolute star. She was a terrific personality. She was a great piano player. She was a great singer. She appeared almost daily in show business gossip columns in both white and black newspapers across the United States. And she was such a personality that everybody wanted to know what she was doing. She had her own radio show, a 15-minute radio show. The way she broke into the business was when she got to Harlem in 1923. She heard that Harry Hansberry's Clam House on 133rd Street needed a male pianist. This was a gay speakeasy, and they needed a male pianist. So she dressed as a man. I mean, people knew she was a woman, and she identified as a woman, but she dressed as a man, and she went and auditioned, pounded out a fabulous song, and she was great. If you're a young person and you're thinking, how do I break into the world of my chosen career, take a leaf from Gladys Bentley's book and recognize that when you do this kind of stuff, you have to have skills. And here are the skills that she had. She could play the piano really well. You should learn how to play the piano right now. Just do it. There's programs you can learn it on. You can learn it online. So you're stuck at home, do it now. She could play the piano really well. She learned 500 songs by heart. She had a great voice, and she could also play without stopping for hours and hours and hours. These were some of her skills. She sang about sissies and bulldaggers, which is lesbians, and her female lovers, and she flirted with women in the audience. And she didn't just do this when she was playing at speakeasy. She did this in every time she performed. Gladys Bentley, here she is. In her earlier life, when she was growing up, her family dragged her from doctor to doctor to try to convert her from being a lesbian to being something that she was not, with conversion therapy, which we know doesn't work. That's probably the reason she left home when she was just a teenager at 16. She said in an article in Ebony magazine, "I appeared at the Clam House, and that was part of Jungle Alley, and I moved up." She said, "I appeared in tailor-made clothes, top hat and tails with a cane to match each costume. 2 black outfits, 1 maroon, a tan, a gray, and a white, and I was an immediate success. And that's because she could really play the piano and sing. She got in there and she played hard." That's where Gladys's Clam House was, at the corner of 133rd Street and 10th Street in Harlem. This is a quote: "For 2 or 3 amazing years at the Clam House, Miss Bentley sat and played piano all night long, with scarcely a break between the notes, sliding from one song to another, with a powerful and continuous underbeat of jungle rhythm, an amazing exhibition of musical energy, a large, dark, masculine lady whose feet pounded the floor while her fingers pounded the keyboard, a perfect piece of African sculpture, animated by her own rhythm." And that is a quote by Langston Hughes, the brilliant writer and Harlem Renaissance poet. Here she is. in her regular day clothes, I guess, or at least for this photograph. She's standing in front of a poster for the Ubangi Club with another guy who looks like he's part of our community as well. In within a relatively short amount of time, she moved from her small apartment. Here's her small apartment, or no, that's where the Clam House Club is. She moved from her small apartment in Harlem to Park Avenue to live in a fancy apartment with prominent white people that cost $300 a month. In those days, and right around that time, a person could get a pretty nice apartment for $15 a month. Certainly could get an exceptional place for $45 a month that would include all of their meals. But her apartment was $300 a month, which means that which would be equal to about $5,000 to $6,000 now. And it was on Park Avenue, and she had servants, and she had a beautiful car. She was really successful, and she moved from the Clam House, where she had started out, to the Ubangi Club in the mid-30s because that was a much bigger club, although it was still in Jungle Alley, which means that black people and white people could see her show. Carl Van Vechten, who was a famous writer and sort of a tastemaker, and he would promote particularly black, he was white, but he promoted black people who were artists and writers and performers to white people to encourage them to go and see them. And he promoted Gladys Bentley. He was friends with her. She sang parodies of popular songs. So she'd take a traditionally white song and she'd change the lyrics so they were risque and obscene and queer and fun, and people loved it. Bisexual movie star Tallulah Bankhead, one of our favorites, visited the Clam House in 1931, and she wrote about it and encouraged people to go there. Here is Carl Van Vechten with Gladys Bentley. Gladys Bentley's the one on the left, of course, and Carl Van Vechten, this was probably in the 20s. He wrote books, and he had fictional characters based on her, and so did Clement Woods and Blair Niles. Those are their books. Carl Van Vechten's book, Parties, had a fictional character that was inspired by Gladys Bentley. And one of the reasons was she was such a character. Everybody loved her. She was so interesting. She was tough and forceful and clearly a lesbian and really skilled at entertaining people. Here she is in her white tuxedo. And I got to say, it looks a little bit like she's got her pants stuffed in there. I don't know. One night in the early 1930s, Bentley sidled up to Broadway columnist Louis Sobel and whispered in her ear, "I'm getting married and you're invited." And when Sobel asked the identity of the lucky band, Bentley giggled, "Man, why, boy, you're crazy. I'm marrying." And then she named another female singer, and I don't know who it is, and I wish I did. But then things changed during the Harlem Renaissance. It changed in Harlem, and part of it was the repeal of Prohibition. That happened with FDR working to repeal Prohibition and to remove that constitutional amendment. In 1933, the people voted Prohibition out. Now younger women had the vote. Young people still couldn't vote, but people repealed the Prohibition Amendment, and so people didn't have to go to Harlem to get a drink anymore. There was also a crackdown in risque acts, and certainly Gladys Bentley's act was risque. And in 1935, there was a big riot that scared a lot of white people that happened in Harlem, and people were afraid to go there because, after all, they could get a drink downtown now. They didn't have to go to Harlem to get alcohol. So Gladys Bentley moved to California and began to play in gay clubs. So this is a poster from actually 1942 when she was playing in San Francisco and here's her name there. She was playing in a gay club that was called Club 440, and she was a headliner. It says America's greatest sepia piano artist. Had to mention that her skin tone was that she was a person of color, and had to mention that she was the brown bomber of sophisticated songs. But this was really a queer club. This is Miss Jimmy Reynard, who's in that picture there, and it says down here, singing gay. Butch Minton is singing gay songs. Rose O'Neill is the female Fred Astaire. This was a lesbian club in San Francisco. Now, Gladys Bentley went to California probably in the late 30s, and into during World War II. And so she was there. Now, World War II was a tough time in clothes because you have to remember that people had to have blackouts. They couldn't have light after it got dark because people were really afraid, particularly the early part of the war, that Japan would bomb and attack and invade California on that side. And they really were afraid. So many people moved away from the coastline. They moved away from Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it hurt clubs. But even more significantly, we had the McCarthy era of 1952. And McCarthy era, Senator McCarthy was very conservative, sort of like it is now with a lot of the ultra-conservative people. And he did communism red scares, and he would accuse people of being gay and accuse people of being communist, and then put them in prison or blacklist them. And I think Gladys Bentley was afraid that was going to happen to her. So she wrote an article in Ebony magazine that had the tagline, "I am a woman again." And she went on to explain that she had found happiness by marrying a man and having medical treatment to correct her strange affliction, which is being a lesbian. And she wrote this article in Ebony herself, and she said that she had married this man who had helped change her. And here she is and all through the articles, all these pictures of her, and here she's saying that she was changed by the man, but this man is Louis Armstrong. This man is not her husband in any possible way. And really, when you begin to look more closely at the article, it's talking about this big opening that she's having in Los Angeles and all these famous guys that came to it. So Louis Armstrong is there because she's opening a show in Los Angeles. But she goes on in the article to say that a doctor had fixed her sex organs and treated her, which had caused her to change. And by the way, for your information, being a lesbian doesn't stop you being a woman. So she goes on in the article to tell her story about Harlem and going to Harlem when she was 16, which is actually a great story. She shows up at 16 and she's a big-time star with a fancy apartment in just a few years before she's even into her middle 20s. But she goes on in the article to talk about how gay people are misunderstood and treated poorly. And actually, if you're saying that, you're kind of advocating for the gay community. Here she is again with a picture of another man, but this guy is Billy Eckstine, who is also a jazz performer and absolutely not this guy that she's supposed to have married. But she was able to change and now she's happy. But the thing is that at the end of the article, she says that whomever this nebulous guy that she is married is, she's already divorced him, and it's only been a few weeks since she got married to him. Interestingly enough, the man that she said that she married actually said publicly that they were never married, and that was all a hoax. In the article, Gladys Bentley says that she's already married again since she divorced the guy, and this all happened in 1952. And the new guy that she said she married also said that they were never married. And she does all of this beard marrying all in the same year. This is all happening in 1952. And none of the photos in this article are of either of her husbands. But she is pictured with this guy. This guy is Crip Hurd. Let's see, Crip Hurd. Crip Hurd, with the incredibly politically incorrect name of Crip, was a man with one leg. He was a dancer, and he also had one arm. He was the most amazing dancer I've ever seen. You can actually see him on YouTube, so look him up, Crip Hurd. And there he is. He was a singer too, and he's singing with Gladys Bentley, and he was famous. He was on movies and stuff, so people knew who he was. And this is all about her. And it turns out that this article where she's talking about being now she's no longer gay is really kind of a PR article about her starting her new show. And being this whole gay or lesbian thing was kind of prurient and caused people to be interested in reading it. And don't forget also, it was illegal to be gay in 1952, and that may have been why she was hiding her identity. Throughout the article, there's these pictures of her looking at the old times the way she was, and now she's washing dishes like a good woman, and she's making the bed. By the way, it says in the article she lives with her mother. Why? The married thing kind of is weird. But then an article came out in the Chicago Defender that was all about, this is 1957, all about the third sex, and they're talking about her, and they're saying that she used to wear men's clothes, and that she had tried to marry a man, but that she had actually acted as a husband to a number of women, or both white and colored. They say that then. And that she had tried to change her ways by marrying a man, but a visiting friend who was visiting her saw two pictures of on the dresser, and they said, who are these people? And she replied, "That's my husband," pointing to the man, "and that's my wife." And that was in 1957. Now, here's an interesting thing. In 1958, she was on, does anybody recognize this? She was on a television show. And there she is, and she's on You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx was one of the Marx brothers, and he had this television show that was a quiz show, and he would talk to people, and he would be ad-lib funny lines, and he would talk to two contestants, and he would ask them quiz questions, and if they got the questions right, they would win money. And sometimes there were famous people, and sometimes there were just not famous people at all. So he had a sort of not famous person who was the man on the show, and then he had Gladys Bentley. So there he is, and he looks at Gladys Bentley and he goes, "Oh, you're the Gladys Bentley," because of course Groucho knew who she was, because she was nationally famous, and of course he was nationally famous too. And he says, "So what have you been doing?" And she says, "I play clubs all over the country, and I just finished a book called If This Be Sin." And she does talk about how she's playing jazz clubs all over the place, and then she says she's done this book. And he says, "What's it about? What's the book about?" And she says, and you can see this episode, it's on YouTube, "It's the story of my life." And so then Groucho says, after they do the quiz thing, they sit down, and or he says to her, "Are you going to play a song for us?" They roll out a piano. He says, "What are you going to play?" She says, "I have 500 different songs." He says, "Pick one." And she belts out this amazing song. She plays really, really fast, and she sings really fast. She sings "Them Their Eyes." And the guest, the other guy who is the guest on the show, that's just a sort of everyday guy, starts dancing wildly, and Groucho stands up from his seat and he starts dancing, because you may really want to dance when you hear Gladys Bentley play. You can hear her on YouTube. You can go to YouTube and see this. But here's the important thing about this story, this book that she wrote, that is her life story, If This Be Sin, which unfortunately was never published. But it came from a poem. The title came from a poem by John Neihardt, and he was a writer and a poet and involved the Harlem Renaissance. And If This Be Sin this is the text of If This Be Sin. I just want to point out this part. It has in it, "How could so much beauty enter in if this be sin? Although we two sinners, burned with bliss, kiss me again that warm, round woman's kiss. Close up the gates of gold. I go not in, if this be sin." In other words, if it's a sin for me to kiss a woman, I'm not going to bother to go to heaven, because this is the way I am, and I'm not going to change. And that's the title of her book. That's the story of my life, she said. She died suddenly at the age of 52 in 1960 of the flu and pneumonia, of the Asian flu. The flu, the effing flu, has a lot to answer for. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm Liz Bradbury, Director of the Training Institute of the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center, and I present a variety of art and history from a queer perspective classes on dozens of different topics, from cave painting to pop art. If you want to have me do a presentation, a 90-minute presentation for your group, they're very funny and fun. You can pick the topic. I have loads and loads of topics. We also do trainings through our cultural competency trainings. We do our cultural competency trainings through the Training Institute on LGBT equity and on LGBT healthcare disparities and other LGBT issues. If you'd like to talk to us about training, please contact me. You can read about the classes and the trainings on our website at www.bradburysullivancenter.org. In the program section, see Training Institute. Also, you can contact me further for information or to donate to enable future vignettes during the virus. Special thanks again to Sarah E. Avery, for the donation that made this video presentation possible. See you next time. And stay safe and stay home.